There are minds so extraordinary that their very existence becomes dangerous. Not because of violence, not because of weapons, but because a single thought, spoken aloud, can shatter the foundations of an empire built on lies. In 1838, a 20-year-old slave escaped from Maryland, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and an intellect that would terrify a nation. Within a decade, his words would be read by millions across 3 continents. Presidents would seek his counsel, then fear his influence. Newspapers would call him a liar, a fraud, an impossibility that could not exist. Because if what he said was true, if a man born into chains could master language, philosophy, and rhetoric better than Harvard graduates, better than senators, better than the very men who claimed his inferiority as scientific fact, then everything America told itself about human nature, about civilization, about the natural order of the world was a deliberate, calculated lie. This is the story of Frederick Douglass in the desperate Decadussalon campaign to destroy him before his intellect could dismantle slavery itself. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by stories of extraordinary individuals who defied impossible odds and changed history through sheer force of will, click subscribe and activate the notification bell, and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these hidden chapters of American history. The United States of the 1820s had built its southern economy on a single, unshakable premise, but that premise required more than physical chains to sustain itself. Cotton was king. Tobacco was currency. And for million human beings classified legally as property-generated wealth, that made America one of the richest nations on earth. But the system required more than chains and whips and auction blocks to sustain itself. It demanded an intellectual framework, a scientific justification that could be published in medical journals, defended in Congress, preached from pulpits, and taught in universities as established fact. Leading physicians at institutions like the Medical College of South Carolina testified under oath that people of African descent possessed smaller craniums, limited cognitive capacity, and inability to comprehend abstract thought or complex reasoning. They published papers with measurements, diagrams, comparative anatomy studies that purported to prove intellectual inferiority as biological destiny. Legislators quoted these findings when drafting laws. Preachers cited them as evidence of divine order. Educators used them to justify exclusion from schools. The pseudoscience was elaborate, detailed, and completely fraudulent. But it served a purpose. It allowed millions of people to participate in or benefit from slavery while maintaining their self-image as moral, civilized, Christian individuals. To maintain this fiction in practice, slave states enacted legal codes more sophisticated and comprehensive than most modern legal systems. In Maryland, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read or write, not discouraged, not frowned upon, illegal, punishable by fines that could bankrupt a family, or imprisonment, or in some counties physical punishment of both teacher and student. The logic was explicit and openly discussed in legislative debates. An illiterate population cannot organize beyond immediate verbal communication, cannot access information their masters don't provide, cannot read abolitionist literature, cannot forge travel passes, cannot document their own experiences for outside audiences, cannot learn that, in other parts of the world, slavery had been abolished, and people who looked like them lived as free citizens with lights. Ignorance was not a byproduct of slavery. It was a deliberately engineered weapon as essential to the system as leg irons and slave patrols. In February 1818, in Tolbert County, Maryland, on the eastern shore, where the Chesapeake Bay meets a landscape of tobacco fields and pine forests, a child was born in a slave cabin on the plantation of Aaron Anthony. The cabin had a dirt floor, gaps between the wooden planks that let in winter wind, and a single fireplace that provided insufficient heat for the Maryland cold. The mother, Harriet Bailey, was a field hand who'd been hired out to a neighboring plantation 12 miles away. Under Maryland law, she remained the property of Aaron Anthony, as did any children she bore. She was allowed to see her infant only during brief nighttime visits. Walking 12 miles after her field labor ended at dusk, holding the baby for a few hours in the dark cabin, then walking 12 miles back before dawn to avoid the overseer's lash for tardiness. The child was named Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He would never know his exact birth date. Slave births were not recorded with the precision given to livestock, though ironically, the pedigree of horses on the same plantation was documented in leather-bound books with dates, times, and lineage traced back generations. He would never receive formal acknowledgement of his father's identity, though whispered conversations among the enslaved community suggested Aaron Anthony himself. A common occurrence that served the dual purpose of increasing the master's property and demonstrating his absolute power over the bodies of enslaved women. These absences, no birth certificate, no father's name, no family history, were not accidental oversights. They were deliberate erasers designed to sever any sense of heritage, any connection to lineage or legacy, any foundation upon which a person might build an identity separate from their status as property. Frederick's grandmother, Betsy Bailey, raised him for the first 6 years of his life in a cabin at the edge of the plantation. She was known in the community as a skilled net maker, her hands weaving fishing nets that were sold throughout the county, though she never saw payment for her labor. She told Frederick stories in the evenings, fragments of family history, names of relatives he would never meet, memories of a time before she was enslaved, though those memories were vague and distant, filtered through decades of trauma. When Frederick was 6 years old, his grandmother was ordered to bring him to the main plantation house. She walked with him through the woods, holding his hand, saying nothing about what was coming. When they arrived, she pointed to a group of children playing in the yard and told him those were his brothers and sisters. Then she left. Frederick stood in the yard watching his grandmother disappear down the path and slowly understood that he had been abandoned, not by choice, but by order. His grandmother returned to her cabin. He would see her only once more in his life. This was his introduction to the systematic destruction of family bonds that slavery required. Children were separated from parents to prevent the formation of family units that might prioritize each other over the master's interests. The psychological impact was calculated. A child with no stable family attachment, no sense of belonging, would be easier to control, less likely to risk escape, more dependent on the master's approval for any sense of security. Frederick lived in this environment for 2 years, sleeping on the floor of a kitchen closet, wearing a single long shirt that provided no warmth in winter, eating cornmeal mush from a trough that all the slave children shared, fighting for food like animals because that was the intended lesson. You are animals. You have no dignity. You survive at our discretion. His mother, Harriet Bailey, made the 12-mile walk to see him perhaps 4 or 5 times during those years. She would arrive after dark, exhausted from a full day of field labor and the long walk, and she would hold him. And sometimes she brought him small treats, a piece of fruit, a biscuit stolen, at great personal risk. Then she would leave before dawn. She died when Frederick was 7 years old. He was not told immediately. He learned about it days later, overhearing a conversation. He was not allowed to attend any burial if there was one. He was given no time to mourn. The work continued. Years later, Frederick would write that he received the news of his mother's death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. Not because he didn't care, but because the system had successfully prevented him from forming the attachment that would have made grief possible. This was the world that Frederick Douglass was born into. A world designed in every detail to break the human spirit and replace it with obedience. But something in Frederick refused to break. In 1826, when Frederick was approximately 8 years old, Aaron Anthony died. The enslaved people on the plantation, including Frederick, were gathered for valuation. They stood in a line while Anoni's heirs and an appraiser walked past, examining teeth, muscles, checking for scars or signs of illness, estimating each person's monetary value like livestock at auction. Frederick was valued and assigned to Thomas Auld, Aaron Anoni's son-in-law, but Thomas Auld had no immediate use for a small child. Soon Frederick was sent to Baltimore to serve Thomas Auld's brother, Hugh Auld, who worked as a shipbuilder. His transfer, arbitrary and unremarkable to the people who arranged it, would change American history. Baltimore, in 1826, was a city of contrasts. The harbor bustled with ships from around the world. Factories produced goods for national markets. A substantial free black community lived in specific neighborhoods, working as laborers, craftsmen, domestic servants, existing in a precarious space between slavery and full citizenship. They could be kidnapped and sold south on fraudulent claims. They had no legal recourse if attacked, but they were free, and their existence proved that freedom was possible. Hugh Auld lived in a modest house on Alice Street in Fells Point, the shipbuilding district. His wife, Sophia Auld, had never owned slaves before. She had worked as a weaver before marriage. A working-class woman unfamiliar with the protocols and psychological postures that slave ownership required. And this inexperience would crack open a door that the entire architecture of slavery was designed to keep sealed shut. Sophia Auld made a mistake that would haunt slave owners across the South when they learned of it years later. She treated the 8-year-old boy as a human being. She smiled at him. She spoke to him with kindness. And when she sat in the evening reading the Bible, Frederick watched with obvious fascination, and she asked if he would like to learn his letters. He said yes. For several weeks, Sophia Auld taught Frederick the alphabet. She showed him how letters formed sounds, how sounds formed words, how words carried meaning. She used the Bible as a textbook, pointing to passages, helping him sound out simple words. Frederick would later describe the sensation of understanding written language as awakening from a long darkness into light. Each word was a tool. Each sentence was a key to a door he hadn't known existed. The marks on paper, which had seemed like meaningless scratches, suddenly resolved into meaning, into ideas, into access to a world beyond his immediate experience. He learned quickly, with an intensity that surprised Sophia. Within weeks, he could read simple sentences. Then, Auld discovered what his wife was doing. The scene that followed would be recounted in detail decades later because Frederick was present, standing in the doorway, listening from the next room, as Auld explained to his wife the catastrophic error she had made. "If you give a slave an inch, he will take an ell," Auld said, his voice tight with genuine fear, not anger. "Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. If you teach that boy how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." Sophia Auld stood silent, absorbing this lesson in the psychology of oppression. Auld continued, his words precise, articulating the unspoken logic that every slave owner understood. If he learns to read the Bible, it will put ideas into his head. He'll start thinking he's as good as white folks. He'll want to know why he's a slave. He'll become unfit for service. He'll ruin him. Sophia Auld never taught Frederick another letter. But Frederick, standing in that doorway, 8 years old, had heard something more valuable than any lesson she could have provided. He had heard the master's terror. He had learned that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom, that knowledge was the one thing they feared above all else, that education was so dangerous to the system that it had to be forbidden by law and prevented by force. And if they feared it that much, that meant it held power. At 8 years old, standing in that doorway, Frederick Bailey made a decision that would alter American history. He would teach himself to read in secret, no matter the cost, no matter how long it took, because if reading could make him unfit to be a slave, then reading would be his weapon. What followed was an education conducted in shadows and stolen moments, an intellectual heist that took years to complete and required the kind of strategic thinking that supposedly enslaved people were incapable of possessing. Frederick befriended white children in the Baltimore streets, poor boys from working families who attended public schools. He carried bread in his pockets, saved from his own meager rations, and he traded food for lessons. 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. A child teaching another child the shape of letters scratched in dirt. With a stick, the sound of syllables, the meaning of words. The boys didn't see themselves as breaking the law. They were just helping a friend, earning a piece of bread, but each lesson was a crime, and if discovered, could result in severe punishment for all involved. Frederick found a discarded copy of the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches and essays used in schools to teach rhetoric and public speaking. The book had been thrown away, its binding broken, some pages missing. Frederick hid it in the shipyard where Auld worked, tucking it between timber planks, and he read it by candlelight in stolen moments, memorizing passages about liberty, natural rights, the evil of tyranny. The book contained a dialogue between a master and a slave written as a rhetorical exercise. In the dialogue, the slave argues eloquently for his freedom, citing philosophy, morality, and logic. The master responds with the standard justifications for slavery: natural order, biblical sanction, economic necessity. The slave systematically dismantles each argument. Finally, the master, defeated by pure logic, grants the slave his freedom, acknowledging that slavery cannot be defended rationally. Frederick read this dialogue until the pages wore thin from handling. He memorized it. He understood that it was fiction, a rhetorical exercise, but it proved something crucial. The arguments for slavery were intellectually weak. They could be defeated through reason. The system sustained itself through force and ignorance, not through superior logic. He began copying letters from ship timber at the Baltimore docks. Carpenters marked wood with destinations and positions. S for starboard, L for lar, SF for starboard forward, L for lar. Frederick practiced writing these letters in the dust, on fences with chalk, on any surface where he could form the shapes until his hand learned the movements. He stole writing materials, scraps of paper, broken pieces of chalk, a discarded pen. He waited until the Auld family left the house. Then he copied words from young Thomas Al's school assignments, practicing the formation of letters, the spacing of words, the structure of sentences. He practiced in the Bible's margins when no one was watching. He wrote in the sand of the shipyard and erased it quickly with his boot when someone approached. He turned education into a covert operation conducted with the caution of a spy in enemy territory. By age 12, Frederick could read fluently, and what he read filled him with a rage that burned cold and patient, the kind of rage that doesn't explode but calcifies into determination. He read newspapers left behind in the old house and learned that in northern states, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, people who looked like him walked freely, earned wages, owned property, sent their children to schools. He read political debates and understood that slavery was not inevitable, not natural, not divinely ordained, but a choice that men made and defended with laws that other men could unmake. He read about Haiti, where enslaved people had revolted and won their freedom, establishing an independent nation that terrified slave owners across the Americas because it proved that rebellion could succeed. He read, and the psychological chains were broken even while the physical ones remained. But reading also brought a new kind of suffering. Ignorance had provided a certain protection, a limitation of imagination that made the present bearable because he couldn't fully conceive of alternatives. Now he could imagine freedom, could understand exactly what was being stolen from him, could measure the gap between what his life was and what it could be. Sophia Auld had been right. Learning had made Frederick discontented and unhappy, but it had also made him dangerous. In 1833, when Frederick was approximately 15 years old, he was sent back to Tolbert County to work for Thomas Auld, who had inherited him when Aaron Anthony died. Thomas Auld had recently married and wanted to establish his household with a full complement of enslaved servants. Frederick arrived in Tolbert County, a different person than the child who had left 7 years earlier. He could read, he could write. He had spent years in a city where he'd witnessed free black people living independent lives. He had absorbed ideas about natural rights, human dignity, and the illegitimacy of slavery. And he made the mistake of letting this show. He made eye contact when Thomas Auld spoke to him, a violation of the expected difference. He moved with confidence, rather than the shuffling head-down posture that slavery required. He asked questions. He spoke with vocabulary that field slaves were not supposed to possess. Thomas Auld found this intolerable, not because Frederick was disobedient in action. He performed his work, but because his demeanor suggested he didn't accept his status as property, and that was more dangerous than any specific act of defiance. Thomas Auld made a decision that he believed would solve the problem. He rented Frederick to Edward Covey. Edward Covey had a reputation throughout Tolbert County. They called him the Snake, and the nickname was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect by both enslaved people and slave owners. Covey was not wealthy. He rented a small farm and owned only one slave himself. But he had developed a specialty that made him valuable to slave owners with a problem. He broke slaves. He took the strong-willed ones, the defiant ones, the ones who had not fully internalized their subjugation, and he returned them docile, eyes permanently downcast, spirits shattered, transformed into the obedient property. But the system required. His methods were sophisticated, almost scientific in their psychological precision. Covey would appear without warning, hiding in cornrows, concealing himself behind buildings, emerging suddenly to catch slaves resting for even a moment, then delivering punishment. He created an environment of perpetual surveillance, where the threat of violence was more effective than violence itself, because it was unpredictable, inescapable, constant. He worked his slaves from before dawn until after dark, in all weather, with minimal food and no rest beyond what was absolutely necessary to prevent death. Exhaustion was part of the method. A person too tired to think clearly, too physically depleted to maintain mental resistance, would eventually surrender psychologically. He varied his punishments. Sometimes whipping for slow work, sometimes for working too fast, which he claimed indicated carelessness. Sometimes he punished for reasons he never explained, because the unpredictability prevented slaves from developing strategies to avoid punishment. If you couldn't predict what would trigger violence, you lived in constant fear, and that fear was the point. Frederick was beaten regularly during his first months with Covey, whipped for alleged laziness, whipped for breaking equipment even when the equipment was old and broke through normal use, whipped for looking tired, which Covey interpreted as deliberate insolence. His back bore scars that would remain for the rest of his life. Raised welts that formed patterns of cruelty documented in flesh. His hands bled from work in the fields, splitting open in the cold, developing infections that were never treated. His mind began to cloud. The books and words and ideas receding behind an exhaustion so profound that some nights he considered whether death might be simpler than survival. He later described this period as the darkest of his life. Worse than the childhood deprivations, worse than the separation from his mother, because Covey was systematically destroying his sense of self, reducing him to the animal status that slavery claimed was his natural condition. For 6 months, Frederick endured this. Then, on an August morning in 1834, something inside him calcified into pure decision. He was working in the fields, weak from illness, possibly heat stroke, when he collapsed. Cvy approached and kicked him, ordering him to stand. Frederick couldn't. Cevey kicked him again harder, then picked up a piece of wood and struck him. Frederick managed to stand and stagger away, walking the 7 miles to Thomas Al's house, to beg for intervention, for reassignment, for anything that would remove him from Cevey's farm. Thomas Al listened, then sent him back. "You probably deserved it," Al said. "Cvy is a good man. You need to learn obedience." Frederick walked back to Covey's farm, knowing that punishment for running away would be severe. But something had changed. During that walk, some internal calculation had shifted. He had begged for mercy and been refused. He had appealed to the system and been told to submit. He had tried every avenue within the rules and found them all closed. So he decided to break the rules. When Covey approached the next morning with a rope, intending to tie Frederick for a beating, Frederick fought back. The fight lasted 2 hours. Covey tried to pin him to tie his hands to call for help from other slaves who stood frozen in the fields, watching something that was not supposed to be possible. Frederick countered every move, not striking blows, but defending, blocking, refusing to submit. He was taller than Covey, younger, and despite months of brutal labor, still strong. Cevey called for assistance. His cousin Hughes came running and tried to help restrain Frederick. Frederick kicked him, and Hughes retreated. They grappled in the barn, in the yard, Cvy trying desperately to establish dominance. Frederick simply refusing to be tied, to be beaten, to surrender. Finally, Cevey stepped back, breathing hard, his clothes torn, his face showing something Frederick had never seen before in a white man's eyes when looking at a slave. Uncertainty. "Now, you scoundrel," Cvy said, trying to reassert verbal authority. "Go to your work. I would not have whipped you half so hard if you had not resisted." But he didn't touch Frederick. He turned and walked away. And he never touched Frederick again for the remaining 6 months of the rental period. More importantly, he never reported the incident to Thomas Al, because to admit that a 16-year-old slave had fought him to a standstill would destroy his reputation as a breaker. His entire business model depended on the perception of invincibility. If word spread that a slave had successfully resisted him, his value to other slave owners would evaporate. So both Frederick and Covey kept the fight secret for different reasons. Frederick had discovered something that the system tried desperately to conceal. The master's power was psychological, sustained by the slave's belief in the master's invincibility. Remove that belief, and the entire structure became fragile. He later wrote, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career. As a slave, it rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. I was nothing before. I was a man now." But he also understood a darker, more complex truth. He could fight back physically and survive. In this specific circumstance, because Covey's pride prevented him from reporting the incident, but physical resistance alone wouldn't free him. The system was too large, too entrenched, backed by law and custom and the armed power of the state. To escape slavery entirely required something more dangerous than violence. It required outsmarting the system itself. After the year with Cvy ended, Frederick was hired out to William Freeland, a farmer who, while still a slave owner, was comparatively less brutal. Freeland provided adequate food, didn't use the whip casually, and allowed his slaves Sunday afternoons for rest. In this slightly less oppressive environment, Frederick did something extraordinary and profoundly illegal. He started a secret school. On Sunday afternoons, in the woods behind Freeland's plantation, Frederick taught other slaves to read. 20 people at first, then 30, gathering in hidden clearings, passing around a single Bible and a few other books that Frederick had acquired, learning letters and words with the intensity of people who understood they were handling contraband more dangerous than weapons. The students ranged in age from teenagers to men in their 50s. Some learned quickly, forming letters and sounding out words within weeks. Others struggled, their minds so conditioned by years of enforced ignorance that the concept of reading seemed almost magical, impossible for them to grasp. But they all understood the stakes. Discovery would mean severe punishment. Whipping sailed to the deep south, possibly death. Yet they came every week, risking everything for the chance to access the knowledge that might somehow lead to freedom. Frederick taught them more than reading. He taught them geographies, explaining where the free states were located, which routes led north, which cities had substantial free black communities that might offer shelter. He taught them about abolitionist movements, about political debates over slavery's expansion, about the fragile coalition of interests that kept the system functioning. He was creating not just literate individuals, but potential rebels. Armed with information, the school operated 4 months before someone, Frederick never learned, who had formed the local authorities. On a Sunday afternoon, armed white men raided the clearing. Frederick and the others scattered into the woods. Several were caught and beaten on the spot. Whipped as an example, Frederick escaped initially, but knew that his involvement was known, that consequences were coming. The school was destroyed, but it had existed, proving it was possible. Planting seeds that would grow in ways Frederick couldn't predict. Some of those students would eventually escape to freedom. Others would teach their own children in secret. The knowledge, once transmitted, couldn't be fully eradicated. But Frederick also understood that his time in Tolbert County was running out. He had fought CVY, he had run an illegal school, he was becoming known as a troublemaker, and troublemakers were sold south to the cotton plantations of Alabama and Mississippi, where life expectancy was measured in years and escape was nearly impossible. He began planning his escape in earnest. Frederick had access to information that most enslaved people didn't. He could read newspapers and maps. He understood geography, knew that Pennsylvania was the nearest free state, approximately 90 miles north. He knew that slave catchers patrolled the roads, that free black people were frequently kidnapped and sold south on fraudulent claims, that the journey would be extraordinarily dangerous. But he also knew that staying meant eventual sale to the Deep South, which was a slower death sentence. He recruited 5 others: Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, Charles Roberts, and Sandy Jenkins. They met in secret, discussing routes, timing, strategies. Frederick forged travel passes, teaching himself to replicate the handwriting of masters, creating documents that would allow them to move through Maryland, claiming they had permission to travel to Baltimore for Easter celebrations. The forgeries had to be perfect. The right paper, the right ink, the right phrasing that a master would use, the right signatures. He practiced for weeks, copying and recopying until the documents looked authentic. The plan was to travel together on Easter weekend when roads would be busy with travelers and their movement might attract less attention. They would follow back roads toward Baltimore, then continue north to Pennsylvania. Once across the border, they would scatter, making their way separately to different cities to avoid capture as a group. The night before Easter, 1836, they gathered one final time to review the plan. Someone betrayed them. Frederick never learned who. Perhaps one of the 5 lost his nerve and confessed to his master, hoping for leniency. Perhaps someone outside the group had overheard their planning. Perhaps a white person had noticed their secret meetings and reported suspicious activity. But the next morning, before they could leave, white patrollers arrived at Freeland's farm with a warrant for their arrest. Frederick and the others were seized, bound, and marched to the county jail in Easton. The forged passes were discovered and confiscated as evidence. They were interrogated, threatened, told they would be sold to the Deep South as punishment, a fate that everyone understood was worse than death. Given the brutal conditions of cotton plantations where slaves were worked to death and replaced with new purchases, Frederick was certain his life, as he knew it, was over. He would be sold away, disappearing into the vast machinery of Deep South slavery, where his literacy and his plans and his dreams of freedom would mean nothing. He would die in a cotton field, his body used up and discarded, his name forgotten. The other men were eventually released back to their masters with severe whippings, but Frederick, identified as the ringleader, remained in jail for a week, waiting to learn his fate. Then Thomas Al arrived and made a decision that never fully made sense to Frederick. Instead of selling him south, Al sent him back to Baltimore, back to Hugh Al with instructions to learn a trade in the shipyards. This decision was inexplicable. Frederick had attempted escape, had forged documents, had recruited others, had demonstrated that he was exactly the kind of dangerous intelligent slave that the system most feared. The logical response was to sell him as far south as possible, to remove him from Maryland, where his connections and knowledge made him a continuing threat. But Thomas Auld didn't do that. Perhaps he feared that selling such a valuable, skilled slave would incur financial loss. Frederick was young, strong, intelligent, potentially worth significant money if properly managed. Perhaps he worried that Frederick, if sold to the brutal Deep South, would eventually speak of his connections to the old family, creating scandal or legal complications. Perhaps he calculated that the shipyards of Baltimore, under Hugh Auld's supervision, would keep Frederick too busy to plan rebellion. Or perhaps Thomas Auld, despite everything, possessed a sliver of human recognition that this young man was different, extraordinary even, and selling him felt uncomfortably close to murder. Whatever the reason, Frederick returned to Baltimore. In April 1837, 19 years old, literate, strategically patient, carrying the knowledge that his first escape attempt had failed because of betrayal, because he had trusted too many people, because the plan had been too complex, he would not make those mistakes again. Baltimore in 1837 was a city transformed by industry and tension. The shipyards employed thousands of workers, both free and enslaved, building vessels for trade routes that stretched across the Atlantic. The city's free black community had grown, creating neighborhoods where people of African descent lived, worked, and built institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, social clubs that provided support networks, and quietly assistance to fugitive slaves. Frederick was hired out to work in the shipyards, learning the trade of ship corking, sealing the seams between planks with oakum and pitch to make vessels watertight. It was skilled labor, physically demanding, requiring precision and experience. Frederick learned quickly, working alongside both enslaved and free black culkers, and it was in this environment at a social gathering for free black people in East Baltimore that he met Anna Murray. Anna was approximately 25 years old, 5 years older than Frederick. She had been born free in Denton, Maryland, the eighth child of formerly enslaved parents who had been manumitted. She worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy Baltimore family, earning wages that she saved with careful discipline. She was literate, connected to the free black community's networks, and aware of the underground systems that helped fugitive slaves escape north. They met at a meeting of the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, a social and educational organization for free black people. Frederick attended occasionally, drawn by the discussions of literature, politics, and current events. Anna noticed him immediately, tall, articulate, carrying himself with a confidence unusual for an enslaved person. They began talking carefully, at first because relationships between enslaved and free black people carried risks. If discovered, Anna could be accused of helping a slave escape, a crime punishable by imprisonment and fines. Frederick could be punished for associating with free black people, which masters feared would give enslaved people dangerous ideas about freedom. But they continued meeting in public spaces where their conversations could appear casual, discussing the future in coded language that bystanders would not understand. Anna had access to information, the movements of trains, the schedules of steamboats, the shifts of patrollers, the names of sympathetic conductors who might look the other way if paperwork seemed legitimate. She knew which free black seamen traveled regularly between Baltimore and Philadelphia, which ones might be willing to lend identification papers for a price or a favor. Frederick had intelligence, the ability to forge documents, and the desperation that made risk irrelevant. They discussed marriage, understanding that it would have to wait until Frederick was free. Marrying while enslaved was legally meaningless. Slave marriages had no legal standing, could be dissolved at a master's whim, provided no protection against separation or sale, but they made a commitment to each other, and Anna began helping Frederick plan his escape with the understanding that if he succeeded, she would join him in the North and they would marry as free people. The plan they developed was insane in its audacity and simplicity. Frederick would disguise himself as a free black sailor and travel by train from Baltimore to Wilmington, Delaware, then by steamboat to Philadelphia, then by train to New York. He would carry identification papers borrowed from a free black seaman, documents that described the bearer in general terms that could fit many people. The plan relied on speed, confidence, and luck. If a conductor examined the papers closely, if he asked detailed questions about seamanship that Frederick couldn't answer convincingly, if any passenger recognized him, if slave catchers happened to be checking that particular train, he would be arrested and returned to slavery, with punishment that might include sale south or mamming to prevent future escape attempts. But staying in Baltimore meant eventual sale anyway. Thomas Auld had made clear that Frederick's presence was temporary, that he would eventually be brought back to Tolbert County or sold to settle debts. The risk of escape and the risk of staying were both potentially fatal. But only escape offered the possibility of freedom. Anna used her savings to purchase a sailor's uniform, wide-brimmed hat, red shirt, black cravat, the distinctive clothing that marked merchant seamen. She arranged for Frederick to borrow free papers from a black seaman she knew, a man willing to lend his identification documents for a day, understanding the risk he was taking that if Frederick was caught with those papers, the seaman could be accused of aiding a fugitive, losing his own freedom. They chose September 3rd, 1838, a Monday morning when trains would be busy with travelers returning from weekend visits. When Frederick's presence might attract less scrutiny, Frederick put on the sailor's uniform that Anna had hidden for him. He carried a small bundle that looked like a sailor's belongings. He had the borrowed identification papers in his pocket and he walked to the train station. His heart a percussion that he forced himself to control because panic shows in the hands, in the eyes, in the voice, and any sign of fear would draw attention. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station was crowded with travelers. Frederick purchased a ticket to Wilmington, paying with money Anna had given him. He boarded the train, finding a seat in the Negro car, the segregated section where black passengers, both free and enslaved, traveling with masters, were required to sit. The train departed. Frederick sat motionless, staring out the window, watching Baltimore recede every mile, carrying him closer to freedom and closer to the possibility of capture. His mind ran through scenarios. What he would say if questioned, how he would respond to challenges, whether he should run if confronted, or try to talk his way through. A conductor approached, checking tickets and papers. This was the moment. If the conductor suspected anything, if he called for authorities, Frederick's escape would end before it truly began. Frederick handed him the seaman's protection papers, documents covered in official seals and stamps, emblems that suggested governmental authority. The conductor glanced at the papers, glanced at Frederick in his sailor's uniform. "I suppose you have your free papers?" the conductor asked. Frederick maintained the exact tone of casual confidence a free seaman would have, slightly annoyed at the question. "No, sir, I never carry my free papers to sea with me. But you have something to show that you are a free man, haven't you?" Frederick showed him the seaman's protection papers again, pointing to the official seals. The conductor examined them. For a moment that stretched into eternity. Then he handed them back. "I suppose so. Go ahead." The train continued north. Frederick sat motionless, breathing slowly, aware that he had cleared one obstacle, but many remained. Slave catchers patrolled train stations. Bounty hunters worked the border regions, earning fees for captured fugitives. Free black people were kidnapped regularly and sold into slavery on forged claims of fugitive status. At Havre de Grace, the train crossed the Susquehanna River on a ferry. Frederick saw a man he recognized, a ship captain who knew him as Hugh, old slave. The captain looked directly at him. Frederick's heart stopped, but the captain said nothing, either not recognizing him in the sailor's disguise or choosing not to interfere. The moment passed. At Wilmington, Delaware, Frederick changed trains, boarding a line that would take him to Philadelphia. He was now in a free state, but that provided no safety. Delaware was a slave state, and even in free states, fugitive slave laws allowed masters to reclaim their property. On the train to Philadelphia, Frederick saw another acquaintance, a German blacksmith who had worked in the Baltimore shipyards. The man looked at him with clear recognition. Frederick prepared to run, but the blacksmith turned away, saying nothing. Years later, Frederick would wonder whether these men had recognized him and chosen to let him pass. Silent acts of mercy or indifference that allowed his escape. Or whether the disguise had been effective enough that they genuinely didn't recognize the slave they knew in the confident sailor sitting in the train car. He would never know. The train arrived in Philadelphia on the evening of September 3, 1838, approximately 24 hours after Frederick had left Baltimore. He stepped onto the platform at the station, surrounded by crowds of travelers, and felt terror more intense than any he'd experienced in Maryland, because now he had everything to lose. In Maryland, he had been property subject to violence and control, but in a strange way, that status had provided a kind of certainty. He knew the rules, knew the dangers, knew what to expect. Now he was a fugitive in a free state, with no money, no contacts, no clear plan beyond reaching New York. He could be captured at any moment. He could be betrayed by anyone. He could starve or freeze when winter came, or be kidnapped by slave catchers who operated in Philadelphia despite its free status. He walked the streets of Philadelphia that night, afraid to ask for help, afraid to trust anyone, sleeping in a doorway, understanding that freedom without resources was its own kind of prison. The next morning, he approached a black sailor on the street and asked for help. The sailor directed him to an abolitionist who provided food, a place to sleep, and information about traveling to New York. Where the abolitionist community was larger and better organized, Frederick took a steamboat up the Delaware River to New York City. Arriving on September 4, 1838, he stood on the dock, watching the city move around him. Thousands of people, none of them his master, none of them with legal authority to control him, and felt the weight of freedom settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. He was free, but he was also alone, hunted, and acutely aware that his freedom was fragile, dependent on not being recognized, not being betrayed, not being caught by the slave catchers who worked New York streets with legal impunity. Frederick found shelter with David Ruggles, a black abolitionist who ran an underground network helping fugitive slaves. Ruggles provided food, clothing, and most importantly, advice. Change your name. Don't tell anyone where you came from. Trust no one completely, and get out of New York as quickly as possible, because the city was full of slave catchers and informants. Frederick sent word to Anna Murray in Baltimore using coded language in a letter delivered through the abolitionist network. Anna received the message, quit her job, gathered her savings, and traveled to New York. Arriving 11 days after Frederick, they were married on September 15, 1838, in a brief ceremony performed by Reverend James W.C. Pennington himself, a fugitive slave from Maryland. The marriage was legal, recognized by the state, a status that had been impossible in Maryland. They took the surname Johnson to conceal their identities, one of the most common surnames among free black people, providing anonymity. David Ruggles advised them to move to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling city with a substantial free black community and a culture of resistance to slavery. New Bedford's economy depended on whaling, which required diverse crews willing to spend years at sea, creating an environment where black men, both free and fugitive, could find work with fewer questions asked about their origins. Frederick and Anna traveled to New Bedford, arriving with almost no money and no contacts. They stayed briefly with Nathan Johnson, a black abolitionist, who suggested they change their surname again. Johnson was too common, too easily confused, providing insufficient distinction if slave catchers came searching. Nathan Johnson had been reading Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, which featured a character named James Douglass, a hero who fought against tyranny. He suggested the name Douglass. Frederick agreed. Frederick Douglass, a new name for a new life. In New Bedford, Frederick found work as a laborer, loading ships, cutting wood, doing whatever physical work was available. The pay was minimal, the work exhausting, but it was his work, his wages, his choice. He could quit if he wanted. He could negotiate for better pay. He could walk away from an abusive employer. These small freedoms, trivial to people born free, were revolutionary to someone who had spent 20 years as property. Anna found work as a domestic servant. Together, they rented a small house, furnished it with second-hand items, and began building. Alive, Frederick continued reading, borrowing books, attending lectures. He subscribed to the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, reading each issue cover to cover, absorbing arguments against slavery, learning the language and strategies of the abolitionist movement. He began attending meetings of the New Bedford Anti-Slavery Society, sitting in the back, listening to speakers, some eloquent, some passionate but unpolished, all dedicated to the cause of ending slavery. And he began to understand that his experience, his story, his voice might be valuable to the movement. In August 1841, Frederick attended an abolitionist convention in Nantucket, a gathering of activists from across New England. He went as an observer, not intending to speak, still cautious about drawing attention to himself as a fugitive. But during the meeting, William Kaufman, a prominent abolitionist who had heard Frederick speak briefly at a smaller gathering, invited him to address the convention. Frederick was terrified. He had never addressed a large audience. He was still legally a fugitive slave, and speaking publicly meant revealing his status, making himself visible to potential slave catchers. His hands shook as he stood before hundreds of people, white and black, all watching him. Expectantel white. He began speaking, describing his life in slavery, not as an abstraction or a political debate, but as a lived reality of violence, dehumanization, and systematic intellectual suppression. He spoke for several minutes, his voice gaining strength as he continued, describing the separation from his mother, the deliberate prevention of education, the psychological warfare of Covey's farm, the fight that had restored his sense of manhood, the secret school, the failed escape, the final successful flight to freedom. When he finished, the audience sat in stunned silence. Then the applause began and continued wave after wave because people recognized that they had witnessed something unprecedented. A fugitive slave who could articulate the horror of slavery with greater eloquence, logic, and moral authority than any white abolitionist they had heard. William Lloyd Garrison, the most prominent abolitionist in America, stood after Douglass finished and asked the crowd, "Have we been listening to a thing? A piece of property? Or a man? A man. A man!" The audience roared back. "Garrison," continued his voice rising, "shall such a man be held a slave in a Christian land? No, no, never." The crowd shouted. Frederick Douglass was hired immediately by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a lecturer, paid to travel and speak about his experiences. For the next 4 years, he traveled constantly, speaking to crowds across the North, describing his life in slavery with such specific detail, such command of language, such intellectual sophistication that audiences were simultaneously moved and troubled because the existence of Frederick Douglass contradicted every justification for slavery. The pseudoscientific claims about intellectual inferiority, the religious arguments about natural order, the economic arguments about necessary labor. All of these collapsed when confronted with a man who had been born in chains and had taught himself to read, write, and speak with eloquence that rivaled the greatest orators in American history, and that made him extraordinarily dangerous. For 1845, Douglass had become famous throughout the North. Crowds of thousands attended his lectures. Newspapers reviewed his speeches, some praising his eloquence, others expressing discomfort at his directness, his refusal to soften the brutality of slavery, to make white audiences comfortable. But this fame carried a lethal risk. As a fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass was still legally the property of Thomas Auld in Maryland. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, slave catchers could capture him at any moment in any state and return him south. His entire life of freedom could vanish in an instant, and his prominence made him an easy target. Abolitionists urged him to publish his autobiography, to document his experiences in permanent form, to create a record that would survive even if he was recaptured, but doing so would require revealing his real name, his owner's name, specific locations, and dates. All the information that would make his recapture trivial. Douglass understood the risk, but he also understood that his story, told in his own words, would be more powerful than any second-hand account. He published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in May 1845. The book was an immediate sensation. 5,000 copies sold in the first 4 months. It was translated into French, German, and Dutch. Newspapers across the country reviewed it, and the reviews revealed the deeper crises that Douglass's existence created. Many reviewers, particularly in the South, suggested the book was too sophisticated to have been written by a former slave. They claimed it must be ghostwritten, a fabrication designed by abolitionists to manipulate emotions and advance their political agenda. This accusation, repeated in newspapers across the South and even in some northern publications, revealed the impossible trap that Douglass faced. If he truly wrote the narrative himself, then the intellectual justifications for slavery, the claims about cognitive inferiority, the inability to master complex reasoning were exposed as fraudulent lies. But acknowledging his authorship meant admitting that a black man could achieve literary excellence that most white Americans could not match, which contradicted fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy that the entire society was built upon. So newspapers did something more insidious than simply denying his authorship. They accused him of lying about being a slave at all. They claimed he was a free-born imposter coached by abolitionists to play a role, performing a character, designed to generate sympathy and donations for the abolitionist cause. They demanded he prove his enslavement by revealing details that would conveniently allow his capture and return to Maryland. Douglass faced an impossible choice: prove his authenticity and lose his freedom, or maintain his freedom and be dismissed as a fraud. He chose a third option. He fled to England. From August 1845 to April 1847, Frederick Douglass toured Ireland, Scotland, and England, lecturing to massive audiences who received him as a celebrity and moral authority. In Dublin, he spoke to crowds of thousands, drawing parallels between American slavery and Irish oppression under British rule, creating alliances between different struggles for freedom and dignity. In Scotland, he addressed church congregations, challenging religious leaders who maintained fellowship with American churches that defended slavery, forcing them to choose between their professed Christian values and their institutional relationships. In England, he met with members of Parliament, writers, reformers, people who treated him not as a curiosity or an exception, but as an intellectual equal worthy of serious engagement. The contrast with America was stark and painful. In England, he could enter any building, eat at any restaurant, stay at any hotel, ride in any train car. The casual, constant humiliations of American racism, the segregated spaces, the refused service, the assumption of inferiority were absent. He wrote to Garrison, "I breathe and lo, the cattle becomes a man." But he also understood that his safety in England was temporary, dependent on distance. In America, he was still legally property, and that status would not change unless someone purchased his freedom from Thomas Auld. British abolitionists, horrified by this reality, raised funds to purchase Douglass's legal freedom. They negotiated with Thomas Auld through intermediaries, eventually paying $71,166, approximately $25,000 in modern currency, to manuate Frederick Douglass, officially providing legal documentation that he was no longer property. Some abolitionists, including Garrison, opposed this purchase, arguing that it legitimized slavery by acknowledging that human beings could be bought and sold. They believed Douglass should remain a fugitive as a moral statement. But Douglass was pragmatic. Legal freedom meant he could return to America without fear of capture, could travel openly, could continue his work without constantly looking over his shoulder for slave catchers. The manumission papers were finalized in December 1846. Frederick Douglass was legally free. But during those years abroad, Douglass had begun formulating ideas that would place him in conflict not just with slave owners, but with his own abolitionist allies. Most white abolitionists, including Garrison, opposed violence. They advocated moral persuasion, believing slavery would end through ethical awakening, through convincing slave owners that slavery was wrong, and convincing Northern voters to support anti-slavery politicians. Douglass had lived in slavery. He had fought Edward Covey, He understood that masters did not release power because of eloquent arguments or moral appeals. He began suggesting publicly that enslaved people had the right to use violence to secure their freedom, that slave rebellions were justified, that the system would not end through persuasion alone. He argued for political engagement, for forming alliances with anti-slavery politicians, even if they weren't perfect abolitionists, for strategic action beyond moral appeals. These positions put him at odds with Garrison, who believed that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document that should be rejected, that political engagement was collaboration with evil, that only moral and separation from slave states would end slavery. When Douglass returned to America in April 8, he moved to Rochester, New York, and announced he would start his own newspaper, the North Star. This decision fractured his relationship with Garrison, who saw it as competition and betrayal. Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, was the primary abolitionist publication, and he believed that starting a competing paper would divide the movement and dilute its message. But Douglass had recognized the deeper truth. Even among abolitionists, even among people dedicated to ending slavery, white allies expected black people to remain supporting characters in their own liberation story. They wanted Douglass to speak at their events, to provide testimony, to be the authentic voice of slavery's brutality, but they didn't want him to lead, to set strategy, to challenge their assumptions. By creating his own newspaper, Douglass controlled the narrative, and the articles he published in the North Star were extraordinary, not just in their content, but in their intellectual sophistication. He wrote about political philosophy, constitutional law, international relations, women's rights, economic theory, all with a command that made it impossible to dismiss him as a single-issue activist or a token voice. He became dangerous in a new way, not just as a symbol of slavery's brutality, but as an intellectual force who could outthink, outwrite, and outdebate the most educated men in America. In 1852, the Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society invited Douglass to speak at their 4th of July celebration. He accepted and delivered a speech titled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" The address is considered one of the greatest orations in American history, a rhetorical masterpiece that used irony, moral force, and devastating logic to dismantle national mythology. Douglass began by acknowledging the significance of July 4, 1776. Praising the courage of the Founding Fathers who declared independence from Britain. He spoke eloquently about the principles of liberty and equality articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Then he pivoted. "Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. "What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July?" Douglass asked, his voice rising. "I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty, an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling, vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." The audience sat in silence as Douglass systematically destroyed every comfortable narrative about American freedom while 4 million people remained in bondage. He spoke for over an hour, his voice never wavering, his logic relentless. He described slavery's brutality in detail, forcing the audience to confront what they preferred to ignore. He quoted the Constitution demonstrating how it protected slavery. He cited the Fugitive Slave Act, showing how the federal government actively supported the system. And he ended with a challenge. "For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." The speech was transcribed, published, circulated. Southern newspapers called for his arrest, claiming the speech constituted incitement to rebellion. Northern newspapers debated whether such rhetoric was productive or dangerous. But no one could refute him because his intellect was the weapon they could not confiscate, the rebellion they could not suppress. In the years that followed, Douglass became an advisor to President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, meeting with him multiple times to advocate for the enlistment of black soldiers and the Emancipation Proclamation. He helped recruit black troops for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. He continued publishing, writing, speaking, becoming one of the most photographed Americans of the 19th century because he understood that images of black dignity and intelligence were themselves political acts. After the war, he fought for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and protected voting rights. He served in government positions appointed by Presidents Hayes and Garfield, 2 roles including U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and Minister to Haiti. He wrote 3 autobiographies, each expanding on his experiences with greater detail and philosophical depth. He continued lecturing into his 70s, his voice never losing the power to command a room, to challenge assumptions, to force audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. On February 20, 1895, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. He was 77 years old, still active, still engaged in the fights for justice that had defined his life. He returned home that evening to Cedar Hill, his estate overlooking the Capitol, a house he had purchased in a white neighborhood that had tried to prevent his residence. Another small victory in a lifetime of resistance. He was speaking with his wife Helen Pitts Douglass, his second wife, a white woman, their interracial marriage itself, a political statement about the day's events. Then he collapsed, a massive heart attack, sudden and fatal. He died within minutes, surrounded by family in his own home as a free man. Newspapers across America and Europe published obituaries acknowledging his extraordinary life. But even in death, the attempts to diminish him continued. Some articles suggested he had been given opportunities unavailable to other black people, implying his success was exceptional luck rather than evidence of equal human potential. Others praised him as an exception, a credit to his race. Language that reinforced the assumption that most black people were inferior, and Douglass was somehow different. They still could not accept the truth that his life proved that intelligence, creativity, moral clarity, eloquence, leadership, none of these qualities are distributed by race. That the only thing preventing millions of enslaved people from achieving what Douglass achieved was the systematic violent suppression of their education and freedom. That slavery was not a natural order, but a choice sustained by deliberate ignorance and defended by people who feared what education would reveal. Douglass had escaped slavery at 20 years old. He spent the remaining 57 years of his life demonstrating, through every speech, every article, every act of intellectual achievement, that the justifications for slavery were lies. He died free, famous, and respected. But the silence that America tried to impose on him, the erasure they attempted when he was born in that cabin in Tulba County, that silence had become impossible because he had spoken and written, and his words remained printed and permanent, a testimony that could not be recaptured or destroyed. There are graveyards across Maryland where slaves were buried without markers, their names unrecorded, their lives erased as if they had never existed. Thousands of people who lived and died in bondage, whose stories were never told, whose brilliance was never allowed to develop, whose potential was deliberately destroyed. Frederick Douglass's grave is in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York, marked with a monument that bears his name, his dates, and the word that summarizes what he represented, freedom. But his true monument is not stone. It is the countless people, then and now, who read his words and understand that education is liberation, that knowledge is power, that no system of oppression can survive when its victims learn to speak, to write, to think, to organize, to resist. His true monument is the recognition that the fight he began for dignity, for equality, for the acknowledgement of full humanity, continues. That the work is unfinished. That every generation must choose whether to accept comfortable lies or confront uncomfortable truths. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing to explore more hidden histories that shaped our world. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Frederick Douglass's legacy and what his story means today. Click the bell icon to be notified when we uncover the next extraordinary story of resistance, courage, and the power of the human spirit to overcome systems designed to destroy it.